The coffee was cold again this morning. I'd poured it, set it on the counter, and then got distracted looking out the kitchen window at the yard. The maple Harold planted 40 years ago. It was doing that thing it does in early October, that slow surrender of color, amber and rust bleeding out from the edges of each leaf toward the center. I stood there watching it for what must have been 20 minutes, maybe more. The coffee was cold when I came back to it, and I drank it anyway. That's what I do now. I drink the cold coffee. I watch the tree. I think about things I haven't thought about in years. I'm not sure what made me think of Margaret today. She was my closest friend during those years, the years between 65 and 75, and I didn't understand until recently, not fully, not with the clarity I have now at 92, what those years actually were, what they were taking from her, from me, from all of us who were in the middle of them without any kind of map. My name is Evelyn Grace. I'm 92 years old, and I've lived alone in this house for 11 years since Harold died. I want to talk to you today about something I believe nobody is saying loudly enough. Something that, if I had heard it spoken plainly when I was 68 or 70, might have saved me years of confusion and a particular kind of suffering I had no name for. I want to talk to you about the loneliest decade of a person's life, and why almost nobody recognizes it while it's happening. I know who is watching this. You're somewhere in that corridor. 65, maybe 67. Perhaps you've just retired, or someone close to you has. Or you're 69 and something has shifted that you can't quite explain to your children, who look at you with love and concern and somehow still manage to miss the point entirely. Maybe you're 72, sitting with a kind of interior quiet that the people around you keep trying to solve as though it were a problem with a simple answer. I know you. Not because I'm special, but because I was you, and I spent years not understanding what was happening to me. So let me tell you, the loneliness that lives in those years, 65 to 75, isn't the loneliness people write about in poems. It isn't the loneliness of sitting in an empty house on a Friday night when you're 23 and wishing you had plans. It isn't even the loneliness of grief, though grief may be part of it. It's something more structural, more quiet, more invisible. And the reason it's invisible is because it comes dressed as ordinary life. You finish your career, or it finishes you. You stop going into an office or a school or a clinic or wherever it was that organized 40 years of your mornings. The calendar that once told you who you were, the meetings, the responsibilities, the particular way other people needed you to show up, that calendar goes quiet, not silent, not yet, but quieter. And you stand in the kitchen one Tuesday morning with absolutely nowhere to be by 9 o'clock, and instead of feeling liberated, which everyone promised you would feel, you feel something you cannot immediately name. That unnamed feeling. That's where this begins. I retired at 63. Harold was still alive then, still sitting at the kitchen table with his newspaper and his black coffee and that particular silence he had around him in the mornings. A useful silence, a thinking silence, not an empty one. I had plans, the way everyone has plans when they retire. I was going to travel. I was going to read all the books I'd been putting off for decades. I was going to take up watercolor painting, which I tried for approximately 4 months before accepting that I had no gift for it, and that the gift I didn't have was making me irritable on Tuesday afternoons. I was going to be present, slowed down, available. And then something strange happened, which is that all those things I was going to do required me to know who I was outside of work. And I discovered at 63 years old that I had only the faintest idea. The work had been organizing me for so long, the schedule, the role, the particular way other people looked at me, as competent, as capable, as someone whose opinion mattered in a room. And when that stopped, When I was no longer the one walking into a meeting with a folder and something important to say, the mirror fogged over. I could still see a shape, but the sharp outline was gone. If you're in those years right now, I want you to hear this. That fogging of the mirror is not depression. It is not cognitive decline. It is not a sign that you're finished or that the best of you is behind you. It is the entirely predictable result of having structured your identity around roles that have ended. It is a disorientation that deserves a name and a clear explanation, and instead, most people either receive a prescription or are told to find a hobby. I received a lot of advice about hobbies. My daughter Catherine, she was in her early 40s then, and she had all the answers that people in their early 40s tend to have. Catherine called me on a Sunday afternoon and said she'd signed me up for a pottery class. Not suggested. Signed me up. She had already paid the deposit. She meant it entirely out of love. That is the thing about Catherine that has never changed. Her love is genuine and total, and she expresses it through action, which means she is always doing things for me before she has checked whether I want them done. I went to the pottery class. I was the oldest person in the room by 20 years. The clay felt cold and resistant in my hands, and the young woman next to me was making something that looked like a real bowl, and I was making something that looked like an argument. I left after the second session and told Catherine it wasn't for me. She said, "Mom, you have to give things a chance." And I sat with that for a moment. The particular patience you develop over decades for the ways your children misunderstand you. And I said, "I've given 76 years a chance, Catherine. I know what is and isn't for me." She went quiet. Then she said she was just worried. "I know you're worried," I told her. "That's what this is about." But what she was worried about, what none of my children quite understood at the time, was that the thing they were observing in me wasn't a problem to fix. It was a passage to survive. Those years, 65, 66, 67, 68, they were the years I was learning, without knowing I was learning it, how to exist without the structures that had always told me I was enough. And that is one of the hardest things a human being can be asked to do, especially when the world around you keeps treating it as a logistics problem. There is a map that most of us receive for life. It's unspoken, but it's thorough. You go to school, you work, you raise a family if that's what happens. You build things, a career, a home, a reputation, a role inside a group of people who need you. The map is detailed and busy through the middle section. And then, somewhere around 65, the map runs out. The road simply ends, and what's beyond it isn't charted. There are no instructions. Nobody sits you down and says, "Here is what the next decade will ask of you. Here is what you'll lose and what you might find. Here is how to grieve the person you were and build a relationship with the person you're becoming." Nobody says any of that. They say, "Enjoy your retirement." They say, "You've earned this." They say, "Now you can do all the things you always wanted to do." And then they go back to their own busy lives, and you stand there with your cold coffee and your fogged mirror, trying to figure out who exactly is standing in your kitchen. Margaret and I used to talk about this on our Thursday walks. This was years after retirement, after we'd both lost our husbands, after we'd each in our own way come through the worst of it and arrived at something a little more solid. She had a way of putting things plainly that I've always envied. She said once, on a gray November morning, when the leaves were all down and the sidewalk was wet, "The thing nobody tells you, Evelyn, is that those years ask you to become a stranger to yourself, and then they ask you to introduce yourself." I've thought about that many times since. She died 4 years ago, Margaret. I miss her every week. Not every day the way I miss Harold. With Harold, the missing is as constant as my own heartbeat, a fact of being alive rather than an event. But Margaret I miss differently. I miss her on Thursdays. I miss her in the particular pitch of a conversation that gets beneath the surface quickly, without ceremony, the way conversations between two women who have known each other for 50 years can do. Becoming a stranger to yourself. That's what those years do. Let me try to name the specific losses, because I think naming them matters. When something is unnamed, it can only be felt. It cannot be examined. It cannot be held at arm's length and looked at honestly. And the loneliness of 65 to 75 is made worse, significantly worse, by the fact that most people in the middle of it don't have words for what they're losing. The first loss is the loss of daily purpose. And I want to be careful here, because this is the one that people dismiss most quickly. Purpose, they say. But you have your family. You have your grandchildren. You have your garden. Yes, I had all of those things. I have Rose, my youngest grandchild, who is 8 years old and who will sometimes sit with me in the kitchen on a Saturday morning and tell me about her week with a seriousness that is almost formal, the way young children can be when they are trying very hard to have a real conversation. I love her utterly. She is not what I mean by daily purpose. What I mean is the particular forward motion that comes from being needed in a structured way, from having a place to go and a role to fill and a problem to solve that was specifically yours because of what you knew and what you'd spent decades becoming good at. That kind of purpose is not replaced by love. It requires grief when it ends. And we do not give people permission to grieve it. When Harold retired, he was 68, I was still working. I watched him for the first year. He was restless in a way that was unlike him. Harold was not a restless man. He had an engineer's patience, a slowness of decision that sometimes frustrated me and often saved us both from mistakes. But that first year, he was up early and pacing. He reorganized the garage 3 times. He started projects in the backyard and abandoned them. He drove to the hardware store on days when he had nothing to buy, just to be somewhere. I understood years later what he had been doing. He was trying to find the container, the shape, the outline, something that would hold him while his identity quietly rearranged itself. He found it eventually. It took 2 years. He began volunteering at the library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, helping teenagers with math, and something settled in him after that. I could see it in the way he sat in his chair in the evenings. The pacing stopped. He was himself again, only slightly different. Quieter in a way that was not sad, but was earned. I didn't understand what I was watching. I should have understood. But we don't when it's in front of us. We only understand it from a distance looking back. The second loss is harder to name, and it has to do with social structure. Your working life provides an almost invisible scaffolding of human connection. There are people you see every day simply because you work in the same building. You don't have to like them particularly. You don't have to seek them out. They are simply there, the way furniture is there, and their presence creates a texture of daily life that you don't notice until it's gone. When it's gone, suddenly the week has enormous empty spaces in it that feel different from leisure. They feel like absence. And filling absence requires effort in a way that filling leisure does not. Making friends after 65 is one of the quiet difficulties of this passage that nobody prepares you for. The friendships that sustained you through your 40s and 50s, those friendships were often built on shared context. The same workplace, the same children's school, the same neighborhood. When those contexts change or dissolve, maintaining those friendships requires deliberate effort from both sides, and not everyone is willing or able to make that effort. People move, people get ill, people become absorbed in the particular demands of their own changing lives, and the friendships that were once maintained by proximity quietly begin to thin. I lost 3 friends in the space of 4 years, not to death but to distance, to the slow drift of lives that no longer shared enough common ground to stay close. It happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice until one morning I was making a list in my head of the people I would call if something important happened, and the list was shorter than I expected. That scared me more than I admitted to anyone. Robert called me around that time. He checks in regularly, my son, in his particular way, which is efficient and warm, but always slightly transactional, as though love is best expressed through problem solving. And I mentioned carefully that I was finding the social landscape different than I'd expected. His response was exactly what I should have predicted. He sent me a link to an app for finding social groups for seniors. He was genuinely trying to help. He always is. I looked at the app for approximately 3 minutes and felt so profoundly depressed by it that I put down my phone and called Diana instead. Diana cried a little, the way Diana does when something touches her. Then she said something that was actually useful. "Mom, you're not losing people. You're learning who stays." And I held on to that. It's imprecise, perhaps, but it had the feeling of something true. Learning who stays. That's part of what those years are about, I think. The friendship inventory, the quiet and sometimes painful reckoning with who is actually in your life versus who was simply part of the structure of an earlier chapter. And the answer, for most people, is that it's fewer than they thought. Not because they're unlovable or because they failed at something, but because life reorganizes and relationships require tending, and not all of them can survive the reorganization. The third loss, and this one people especially don't want to talk about, is the loss of being seen as vital, as someone who matters to the larger story, as someone whose knowledge is current, whose perspective is relevant, whose presence in a room changes what happens in that room. This loss arrives gradually, sometimes so gradually you can mistake it for something else for years. A quieting at dinner tables when the conversation turns to certain subjects. An assumption, made kindly, that you wouldn't be interested in a particular new thing. A slowdown in the rate at which people ask for your opinion, your advice, your reading of a situation. I remember the first time I felt invisible. Not alone, not lonely in the old sense, but actually invisible, as though my presence in a room was registered but not quite landed on. I was at a birthday dinner for one of my grandchildren, Sophie. I think she must have been 19 or 20. And there was a conversation happening at the table that I had a great deal to say about. I knew something they didn't know. Not from books, from living. From having watched a version of exactly this situation unfold 40 years earlier, from the inside. And I tried, twice, to enter the conversation. Both times I was received the way you receive something you care about, but can't quite fit into what you're currently doing. Warmly, but briefly. And then the conversation moved on without me. I drove home that night thinking about Harold, thinking about how he used to listen to me when I talked, the particular quality of attention he gave, not always, God knows, not in the early years when we were both too busy and too certain and too young to be truly patient with each other, but later. After 40 years of marriage, there was a quality of attention between us that I have not experienced since. He listened the way you listen when you know someone deeply and still find them interesting, and that is not a common gift. I know that now more clearly than I did when I had it. The invisibility is real. I want you to know that if you're feeling it, it isn't your imagination. It isn't bitterness or self-pity dressed up as observation. There is a real shift in how the world orients toward people who are no longer in the central roles, no longer producing in the visible, marketable ways that our culture has decided constitute value. And navigating that shift, finding your own sense of value independent of whether the room notices you, that is some of the most important interior work of those years. It is also work that nobody assigns you, nobody coaches you through, and nobody gives you credit for when you've done it. There's another thing I want to say, and it's about the body, because those years, 65 to 75, are also the years when the body begins to make itself known in ways it didn't before. Not necessarily dramatic ways, not necessarily illness, though sometimes illness, but a general lowering of the physical ease you'd taken for granted, the knee that aches on stairs, the morning stiffness that wasn't there at 55, the glasses that are now not optional, the driving at night that is now a consideration rather than a given. These things are small, individually. Together, they add up to a new relationship with your own body, one that requires more negotiation and more attention and more adjustment than before. And here is what I find people don't say. The body changes are not just physical, they are psychological. They are a daily reminder of mortality in a way that feels different from knowing intellectually that you will die. This is different. This is the body telling you, in specific and concrete terms, that you are in the latter portion, that the long middle section of the map, the busy, crowded part, is behind you. And sitting with that information, really sitting with it, not pushing it away with activity or distraction or nervous cheerfulness, is one of the things those years require, and almost nobody is equipped to do. I wasn't equipped. I pushed it away for years, kept busy in the particular way you keep busy when you're afraid of what you'll think if you stop. Harold used to tease me about it gently. He'd look up from his newspaper and watch me moving through the house, accomplishing things, and he'd say something like, "Evelyn, the house will still exist if you sit down." He had a way of saying things that landed without effort. I miss that especially. I miss being known well enough to be said the right thing to. Sophie. She's 25 now, my eldest grandchild, and she has her grandfather's quality of attention in ways that sometimes startle me. Sophie called me last spring and asked me to tell her honestly what the hardest thing was about getting older. Not the obvious things, the honest things. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. It was one of the best conversations I've had in years. She asked the right questions, and then she waited for the real answers, not the polished ones. And I told her about the fogged mirror, about standing in the kitchen of my own life and not recognizing the outline. She said, "So it's like retiring from yourself." Yes, that's exactly what it is. Retiring from the self you knew, and having to find out, at 65 or 70, who you are without all the scaffolding. The work of those years, the real work, is not pottery class, and it's not the app for senior social groups, and it is absolutely not the relentless, cheerful productivity that some people take up as a defense against the quiet. The real work is the interior kind. It's sitting with the quiet and letting it tell you something. It's learning to be present with yourself in a way that the busy decades didn't require. It's taking inventory of what you actually value, not what you were supposed to value, not what was useful to value when you were building a life, but what is true for you right now at this exact point in the story. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the language of something I said I wanted to avoid, the self-help books, the motivational calendars, but I mean it more plainly than that. I mean, sit in a chair and think. Not meditate necessarily, not in the formalized way. Just think. Let the thoughts come. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them tell you what you've been avoiding. And then slowly, let them tell you what you still want. Because here is the thing about those years that surprises people, or that surprised me anyway, when I eventually found my way through them. They are not the end. They feel like the end sometimes. They feel like the last chapter of the main story, the part where things are resolved and wound down and prepared for the final page. But they're not that. They are a threshold. They are the place where one version of you ends and another, less defended version begins to be possible. And the second version, I can say this from 92 with absolute conviction, is better in certain ways that the first version couldn't have imagined. At 80, I knew myself better than I had at 40. At 85, I had less patience for pretense of any kind, and more patience for most everything else. At 92, I have a relationship with each day that is the most honest relationship I've ever had with time. I know it's limited. I know each morning is something specific, not just a unit of productivity to be filled. The maple in the yard, the cold coffee, the memory of Harold reading the paper at the kitchen table, 40 years of mornings stacked behind a single image. These things are not consolation prizes. They are what the work was for. But none of that was available to me at 68. At 68, I was in the passage. I was the fog. And I want to say to you, if you are in the middle of it right now, the fact that it's hard does not mean it's wrong. The fact that it's lonely doesn't mean you failed at something. The loneliness of those years is almost structural. It comes from being in a transition that the world doesn't properly recognize as a transition, that your family doesn't have the vocabulary to support, that the culture doesn't honor as the serious and demanding thing it actually is. You are not being dramatic. You are not in decline. You are in one of the most significant passages of a human life, and you are largely doing it without a map, without guides, and without anyone naming it clearly. I'm naming it now. Late, in my case. 11 years too late to tell Margaret on one of our Thursday walks, but I'm naming it for you. What helped me, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, the way trees grow, was deciding to take the passage seriously, not as a problem to manage, as an experience to inhabit. I stopped trying to recreate the structure of my working years and started asking different questions. Not, what should I be doing, but what do I actually notice? Not, who am I supposed to be now, but what is still true about who I've always been, underneath everything. Not, how do I stay busy, but what kind of quiet can I learn to sit in? Harold helped me with that last one without knowing he was helping me. All those years of watching him be still, the Sunday afternoons in his chair with a book he wasn't really reading, the way he could sit on the back porch for an hour and not seem to need anything from that hour except the sitting. I thought I didn't share that quality. Turns out I was just waiting to learn it. The quiet I have now, in this house, alone, is not empty quiet. It's full. It's where I do my clearest thinking, and where Harold is most present to me, and where I sometimes find myself understanding things I didn't understand when the world was louder. But I want to be honest about the loneliness too, because I said I would be. It does not entirely resolve. It changes in character. It becomes something you've named and accommodated, rather than something that catches you by surprise. But the specific loneliness of being 92 and having most of the people who knew your whole story now gone, that is real and ongoing, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. There are mornings when the house is so quiet that I have a brief, fierce wish to go back. Not to youth, necessarily, just to a time when Harold was downstairs with his newspaper, when the noise of a full life was all around me, and I was too inside it to appreciate what the noise meant. But then Rose will come on a Saturday and sit at the kitchen table with her particular formality and tell me about what happened at school, and her face will have that quality children's faces have when they're concentrating very hard on being understood by someone they love. And the quiet recedes. Not permanently, but enough. Enough is something I've learned to trust. At 92, enough is not settling. It is precision. For those of you in the passage right now, in the fog of 65 or 68 or 72, I want to leave you with this, and I want to say it plainly rather than beautifully, because I think plain is more useful right now than beautiful. What you are experiencing has a name. It is a transition, not a failure. The loneliness is structural, not personal. The identity loss is real, and it deserves to be grieved, not managed. The work of those years is interior work, slower, less visible, and more important than anything on the pottery class schedule. The people who love you will mostly not understand what you're going through, not because they don't love you, but because they haven't been here yet. Find the ones who have. Talk to them. Listen to them. And give yourself the one thing that this passage requires above all others, which is time. Not time to fix it, just time to be in it. Time to sit with the cold coffee and the changing tree and let the passage do what it came to do. It takes you apart. That's true. It is supposed to. What comes after is worth it. That's also true. That I can promise. I'm Evelyn Grace. I'm 92 years old. I'm still here.